See. Yes. Okay. So today's book club features Irina Tomescu-Dubro and Christoph Wolf, editors, along with Kazimierz Slomzinski and Craig Jenkins of the Survey Data Harmonization in the Social Sciences.
Just to follow up a little bit on that meeting we had.
May I ask everybody to put themselves on mute, please? I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. Thank you very much. This book is hot off the press. It was published just this past November, and thank you so much for joining us, Irina and Christoph. I am Martha Stapleton, Vice President in the Economics, Justice, and Society Department at NORC, member of the DC-AAPOR Program Committee, and your host for this session. The Book Club 2.0 series is brought to you by your DC-AAPOR Program Committee. So for those unfamiliar with this series, or as a reminder to any regulars, the format is straightforward. First, Irina and Christoph will present an overview of their book, including highlights and insights. During their presentation, please mute your microphones and use the chat feature in Zoom to enter thoughts and questions. And then we'll open up the floor for discussion, starting with items from the chat box and then more generally. And if you're comfortable, please do feel free to turn on your cameras and ask your question or provide feedback directly. And you're also invited to contribute reactions and comments to each other, as this is a discussion, not solely a Q&A. And I will say that Irina and Christoph have also offered, if people would like to chime in with clarification or questions to extend what they're hearing during the presentation, they are comfortable with that as well. And then at the end of the hour, our illustrious DC-AAPOR program chair, Melissa Sedade, who's also on with us, will announce the name of the DC-AAPOR member who has won a copy of Irina and Christoph's book. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our guests. Irina Tomescu-Dubro is a professor of sociology at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology, Polish Academy of Sciences, or PAN. She conducts survey-based research on social stratification and social change, and relatedly, on survey data harmonization. Irina is the PI of the project Structures and Futures, the Polish Panel Survey, or PolPan, 1988 to 2023, which is funded by Poland's National Science Center. She was previously co-PI in the NSF-funded Survey of Doctorate Recipients project that explored ex-post harmonization of cross-national survey data. And Melissa is dropping some links in the chat if anybody wants to explore further some of these surveys and projects I'm mentioning. Since 2021, Irina is the director of the Graduate School for Social Research of the PAN Institutes of Philosophy and Sociology, Psychology, and Political Studies, while also co-directing the Cross-National Studies Interdisciplinary Research and Training, or CONCERT, program of the Ohio State University in PAM. Christoph Wolf is president of Giese's Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences and professor of sociology at Mannheim University, Germany. He has been a PI of the German General Social Survey, the European Values Study, and the International Social Survey Program, or ISSP, of which he was also the secretary from 2015 to 2021. His research interests include survey methodology and survey statistics. He is co-editor of the SAGE Handbooks of Survey Methodology and the SAGE Handbook of Regression Analysis and Causal Inference. And I should say, Irina and Christoph will be presenting on the book. However, one of their illustrious co-editors, Kazimierz Slomzinski, is also attending. He is here to chime in and enhance as needed. And he is a director of CONCERT that I mentioned before, the Cross-National Studies Interdisciplinary Research and Training Program at The Ohio State University. The CONCERT program facilitates research, graduate training, and undergraduate education through opportunities to engage in complex research projects with a cross-national perspective. Professor Slomzinski's areas of expertise include race, class, and gender stratification, occupations and work, population and health, and cross-national research methods. We are so happy to have you here, Irina, Kazimierz, and Christoph. Thank you for joining us in your time zone that is far ahead of ours right now. I am going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to open this presentation, and Irina will cover the second half of this presentation. Let's see if I can manage to control this presentation. Yes. So there is a fourth person involved in editing this book. Let me see. So I hope this is stable now. What we're trying to do is I am trying to control the screen of Irina's computer, which is in the US, and I'm sitting in Germany, and so the reaction time seems to be a little bit delayed, and that's why I was too fast. Okay, let's begin again. So the three of us were introduced, but there's also Craig Jenkins, a fourth editor, also professor at Ohio State University. And the four of us actually were working together and collaborating on this volume for the last couple of years. Let's see if this moves forward. Yes. So we would like to begin by giving you a sense of what we had in mind when we were coming together for our first meetings and considering to put a volume on survey data harmonization together. Of course, you could imagine a volume with 21 chapters will serve different purposes, but first of all and foremost, it was about taking stock of the state-of-the-art in survey data harmonization. Something that, depending a little bit on how you define the this line of work, probably can be or is going back some 70 years with the first comparative survey projects that we have seen in the social sciences. This line of work, of course, has increased its importance with the advent of the large comparative surveys like the European Value Study or the East Asian Social Survey, the European Social Survey, or the barometer series that go around the world. We have tried to include a global perspective with 60 authors from 4 continents, and we do cover a lot of the major comparative longitudinal survey projects that are just mentioned here with their acronyms. We might go into one or the other a little bit more in detail later. But you see, it's the World Value Survey, for example, or the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth from the US. So very different types of surveys, but also initiatives from official statistics like the SHASH, which is from an African initiative to harmonize official statistics across African countries. So we do cover or strive to cover harmonization approaches in a very, very broad sense, and different principles followed in this line of work. Now I hope, yes. Now this slide with a lot of text on it, so it is going to be up there for the next couple of minutes, so you have time to digest what's on it, serves several purposes here. First of all, it's important for us to make clear and point out that harmonization takes place over the entire life cycle of a survey. So each of the stages has to be considered if you do comparative work and you ask yourself, how do we make these data comparable in the most to the fullest degree that is possible, given all the constraints that we face in collecting survey data. So it is really not only about a questionnaire, it is about sampling designs. It is about, of course, the questionnaire, the instrument that we use, translation procedures that we use, but it's also about the field work, about incentivizing respondents, about mode of data collection, about preparing interviewers, about data preparation, about documentation. So it really encompasses every step in the survey data lifecycle. And in particular, if you plan a comparative study, that is your perspective on harmonization. So it's upfront or ex-ante, as we might call it, harmonization that would cover this entire process. Now, if we think about these projects that are sketched on the left and right-hand side of this middle column. So consider this project A as being a survey that you want to do in the US, Canada, and Mexico. And so you plan the survey, you have a Spanish questionnaire, you have an American English questionnaire, you probably have a French questionnaire also for Canada. And you collect these data in these different contexts, and then you harmonize the data later, put them together in one file, describe the data. So you also have a combined harmonized metadata file. And that seems to be quite straightforward because that's something you plan from the scratch. You have one research question. You want to compare these three countries or societies with respect to some traits. And then you do this comparative survey. Now consider a different project B that compares Ireland and the UK, covering essentially the same topics as project A. But at the beginning, projects A and B weren't aware of each other. But now someone comes along and sees, oh, there's this wonderful project A and this wonderful project B. Wouldn't it be nice to compare the US, Canada, and Mexico on the one hand side with the UK and Ireland? And then you would have to put these existing data together in a new harmonized data file, taking into account all the particularities of the different projects. And so here you would do ex post harmonization. So after the fact of data collection, you would have to find ways to make the data as comparable as possible, try to document as close as possible deviations from this ideal so that people analyzing the data later are warned and know that they have to be cautious to certain degrees. Also, as we'll see later, you might want to produce some additional variables that you can use actively in your analyses, controlling for differences in the process of data collection. For example, controlling for the number of scale points an item was used in the different projects, or mode of data collection for that matter. So as this picture shows you, harmonization of survey data is a very complex, or can become very complex very fast. We have to distinguish input and output harmonization. We also get a feeling that many people are involved, so primary researchers, fieldwork agencies, but also secondary researchers and projects that put together survey data after they have been collected. So probably survey data archives, infrastructures for research data, and the like. So a very complex process with a lot of stakeholders in the process. So our aim was really to unravel some of these parts in this process, to highlight the challenges people have to overcome in this process, and differentiate between these different kinds of harmonization approaches by highlighting their differences, but also pointing out the shared concerns, for example, on the question of data quality, and in relation to data quality, data documentation, and also present some solutions people have develop in the context of different projects. And as I said, many people and institutions are involved, in particular, of course, data infrastructure people in comparative social survey research. These could be agencies, these could be groups at universities, these are certainly data collection people or institutes like NORC or GACES or similar institutes around the world. Now, I would like to give you an idea of the different parts in this book. We have divided the 21 chapters basically into 5 parts. So there is a framing of 3 contributions, an introduction, and then a more general meta-reflection on data harmonization as it relates to survey data, also reflecting on the history of this branch of data work, pointing out also professionalizations that have that were achieved in this line of work. And then we end with an outlook on possible future scenarios for survey data harmonization. In between these framing contributions, the book is divided into 4 parts, and I would just highlight all of those parts for you. So in part 1, we do really present in parts 1, 2, and 3, we present projects that are engaged in harmonizing survey data and providing them as a common good to the research community. And the difference between these projects are basically if they are ex-ante or ex-post harmonization projects, and if they are more or less general, or if they're what we call domain-driven projects. So in part 1, we have projects that are meant to be comparative surveys that are planned in advance. So this is the typical example of ex-ante harmonization. Surveys like the World Value Survey or Afrobarometer or as I said, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. They all are projects where people sit together, have some ideas about a questionnaire, try to design rules for sampling, for field work, etc. So really try to make the process of data collection as comparable as possible. This is a little bit different in the studies that we covered in part 2. Here, these projects use existing data to produce new data projects, new data products. The largest of these, the Survey Data Recycling project, is one that Irina and Maciek are PIs and were involved in very, very heavily the last couple of years, in which they literally harmonized thousands of different data sets coming from all these other survey projects that are mentioned above. Another example is the cross-national equivalent file that takes, for example, PSID data from the US or from the German socioeconomic panel data. This focuses on socioeconomic variables and socioeconomic research questions in a panel format. So all of these data mentioned here, I think the EPUMS project is another one that you probably know and have heard of, are projects that use existing data to build new data products and offer new research possibilities. And finally, we have these domain-driven ex-post harmonization projects like projects in epidemiological research or family research or time use data. So very particular where you also have to come up with solutions for very particular problems. For example, in the realm of time use data, you have different approaches to record time use, also different resolutions of time, 10-minute intervals, 15-minute intervals, hourly recording, and you have to somehow resolve these different time resolutions to a common standard. All these projects that are covered in parts 1, 2, and 3 follow in their description the same 5-step logic. They all cover some the methods they apply. They discuss at length how they document their harmonization decisions and how they assure quality of their data. They mention the challenges they face in harmonizing their particular type of data and how they overcome these. They, if they have developed software tools, these are described. And this is also, I think, an interesting chapter for a lot of us, just revisiting these projects and see what solutions do they have technically, and is there anything to learn from that. And finally, there are some general recommendations for users of these harmonized data. And part 4, the last part, is a little bit different. It has 4 chapters reflecting on methodological issues in harmonized survey data. The first one, assessing and improving comparability, is a chapter that I would like to introduce to you in a little bit more detail. Then there is a chapter on the statistical approaches to look at comparability and measurement invariance. So basically multi-group confirmatory factor analysis approaches. Then there is a chapter discussing the pros and cons to use weights in harmonized survey data collections and possible alternatives. And then finally, there's a chapter discussing a little bit more in general challenges that one faces when analyzing harmonized survey data. As I said, I would like to highlight this first chapter in this part a little bit more. This is chapter 17, authored by Ranjit Singh and Marcus Quant, and it is titled Assessing and Improving the Comparability of Latent Construct Measurements in ex-post harmonization. Now, what is this all about? So it's about a latent construct, let's say political participation. And assume 2 surveys have measured this construct with slightly different items. You know, all these items of going to a demonstration or signing a petition or taking part in a strike or things like that. And we have slightly different batteries to cover this type of activity, also depending a little bit on the context in which you ask these questions, maybe also the population you ask these questions of. Now, is there any way, if you only have partially identical items, that you could still compare the latent constructs across these samples? So this is the question authors ask, and they begin very basic with discussing validity and reliability. And of course, even in this somewhat complicated case, there's no magic bullet. You begin with assessing validity based on considerations when you look at the questionnaire. So assess faith validity, then you might look at criterion validity and do some statistical analysis, or look at confirmatory factor analysis. The result should indicate at least a degree to which instruments may be comparable. And oftentimes you probably would end up with an assessment that maybe not all items, but a subset tap into really the same kind of latent construct. Very similarly, with respect to reliability, you just use more or less common approaches. You could compute Cronbus alpha. You could do a little bit more fancy reliability analyses, but in the end, you would have an assessment, an estimate of the reliability of instrument A and B. And now the question is that the end of the story? And probably not, because if it turns out that reliability of one instrument is very different from that of another one, then you would have to correct for attenuation. As we all know, if an instrument is not very reliable, then correlations of this instrument with another instrument are just much lower because of measurement error that we have in the first instrument. And so if we have instruments with very different shares of measurement error, then any analyses comparing these two samples would be a little misleading, because in the sample with the lower reliability, correlations would be lower just because of the measurement error. And we know there are measures to attenuate, to correct for this attenuation of measurement error and thereby improve comparability. And of course, you could do it in a more fancy statistical manner, and the authors point to ways to do that. But their main point is really that we begin thinking about approaches to assess these matters in harmonized data. One issue that bothers us in almost any, at least ex post exercise of data harmonization is that items are measured on different answering scales. So some surveys just like 5-point scales, other favor 4-point or 7-point scales. And the big question is, of course, even if it's the same item, can we somehow harmonize the answering scales? And there are a lot of different approaches you could do that. So very straightforward, you could just stretch or squeeze everything into the same yardstick. So let's just turn to the next slide already. So assume there is a target scale with 7-point scales that you see on the upper here up on the slide, and then in the middle you would have a 5-point scale that is stretched linearly to the values 1 to 7. So we just have 5 scale points that are just stretched so that they now cover values from 1 to 7. Of course, you don't observe a 2, you don't observe a 3, but somewhere in the middle you have a data point that here is represented by 2.5. Now, if you do linear stretching, that is one way to make things comparable. It does lead to the stretched variable having a larger than usual variance, standard deviation here. And it is a variance that is just a methods effect. And that there is another approach that was designed by the SDR project that I mentioned before, that is linear stretching, taking account this variance effect. And here, I think the interesting observation is that you don't stretch all the way to the 1 or the 7, but just stay shy of these extremes, because the argument also could be that if we think about a latent distribution of whatever we measure, then in the 5-point scales, we just didn't reach so far into the extremes as the 7-point scale. So I think it makes sense from a statistical point of view, but also from a conceptual point of view, not to do linear stretching to the fullest, but take into account differences to which a continuum was covered in the original answering scale. But certainly this is something that could be discussed also later. And by this, my time is up, and I hand over to Irina.
Irina, please come off mute.
Okay. Yes. So thank you. I would like to point here that common findings pertain to a condensed set of common insights from the book and not findings from specific chapters, which, given that the volume, as Christoph mentioned, has 21 chapters, may come as a small reassurance for us today. What we would like to highlight is that producers of comparative survey data sets, both in the case of new data collection and in ex-post harmonization efforts, explicitly factor in the role of harmonization decisions for data quality. And they approach accurate harmonization documentation as intrinsic to good quality data. The second issue is that there is a certain degree of coordination between stakeholders in projects harmonized and ante and projects harmonized ex post, but this usually happens ad hoc. And if we would think systematically towards bringing this type of actors in closer communication, this may benefit data infrastructure for comparative survey research. We will return to these points in a minute. That's why they are in blue. Another issue that comes across the book is that we see that thanks to technological developments, we have larger power of computers and advanced statistical methods, the comparative data sets, regardless of the type of harmonization they rest on, have become increasingly complex. Their scope is broader, the file sizes are larger, and their structure often involves both hierarchical and non-hierarchical nesting of observations, which means that we have to work with more complex data sets. That, as a consequence, leads to the fact that for the good and difficulty that comes with it, managing and or analyzing these comparative data sets increasingly involves interdisciplinary collaboration and includes greater reliance and involvement of computer and data scientists. Now, returning to data quality and harmonization documentation, we find that the total survey error and responsiveness to user needs are very useful paradigms for both ex-ante and ex-post harmonization projects. In ex-ante, we see that TCA provides the taxonomy of errors that data producers seek to minimize, and responsiveness to users' needs makes the case for comprehensive on-the-fly documentation so that both ongoing quality control during survey production is possible, and the resulting data are interpretable to the broader research community. This is stuff that we know, and it's good to see it reinforced across all the ex-ante harmonized projects that bring this information to the book. In ex-post harmonization projects, total survey error provides the framework to identify variation in given dimensions of survey data quality that could affect the new harmonized data set. So that means we can look ex post, right? Retrospectively, we look at the quality of the source surveys that we plan to harmonize information from. We define certain dimensions of quality based on the theory stemming from TSC, and then we attempt to measure this variation. It also provides, TCA also provides the framework to identify variation in source item properties, such as what Christoph mentioned, differences in length scales or wording, but also in harmonization decisions, which could affect the validity and or reliability of the target variables. And then together with responsiveness to users' needs, we can consider the insights from TCA in order to construct and make available in the harmonized data set indicators or flags, as sometimes projects refer to, indicators of source survey quality and indicators of the harmonization process that capture these types of methodological variability. Doing so minimizes source information loss, which we know generally ex-post harmonization projects have a hard time dealing with, and maximizes user flexibility of the new harmonized data set, because it is possible to either include the controls in analysis and or subselect parts of the harmonized data set that correspond closer to the research needs of a given user in order to work with what one would like to. And of course, there is the importance of documentation, both accurate and on the fly, but also, which applies also to ex-ante harmonization projects that take into consideration different levels of detail. Why so? Because, and this also leads me to the next slide, namely that, as Christoph pointed earlier, there are different stakeholders in the survey harmonization projects, and there is a potential cooperation among them, which depends on various things and may be more or less realized. Now, what this graph tries to show is that yes, we encompass the survey life cycle. It could have been round, but it's not. It's more along the timeline that we start with. Ex-ante harmonization projects, in a sense, start at the point of data collection, and then we have as main stakeholders the funding agencies, data producers, data distributors, and data users. Now, in a sense, we can find the same typology of stakeholders for ex-post harmonization, which picks up where ex-ante left, meaning the data are publicly available. And then it starts again into data production, but not through collecting data, but reprocessing information from the data that were already shared. Distributing this information and then hoping that others use the data. So what we are seeing here is that we have a number of stakeholders. They can fit into common typologies, but if we look into these typologies, of course, there's variation. The key example here is the fact that data producers for ex-ante harmonization projects have as a key player the data collection agencies, whereas we have no presence of data collection agencies and ex-post harmonization projects. So, and what this wants to show is that that these actors actually have they have a different approach to and different views of the roles of ex-post harmonization, ex-ante and ex-post. So what I'm trying to say here is that their role, so we have the participation of different stakeholders in actual harmonization differs in the two types, and therefore also the room for communication will differ. We will have, for example, quite close discussions and interactions between distributors of ex-ante harmonized projects and data producers of ex-post harmonization projects. And this is especially the case since ex-post harmonization projects are not allowed generally unless it is their own data that they, so let's say it again. Data producers of ex-post harmonization projects cannot share the source data that they use for harmonization. So if, for example, in SDR, we harmonize information from the World Value Survey, from ESS, from EVS, we can provide and share with the community of users the harmonized data set, the target variables, the harmonization controls, but not the source data files from which we constructed the variables, because this is commonly the policy of data producers of original source data. So from this point of view, the communication between data producers of ex-post harmonization projects and data distributors, who may be the producers or archiving agencies of ex-ante harmonized projects, must be very close in order to ensure that the source data sets are preserved in the form in which they were used for ex-post harmonization. But what we also see more from practical examples of how these projects turn out is that actually the insights that ex-post harmonization generates, whether it relates to certain aspects of source data quality, or whether it relates to the fact that we see that given concepts are measured similarly in source data, yet there is a small variation perhaps in the length of the scale, which may be corrected, could lead to the fact that closer information and collaboration or coordination between ex-post harmonization producers and ex-ante harmonization actors could lead to products that contribute to the data infrastructure for comparative research, in the sense that we make a concerted effort of tying ex-ante and ex-post harmonization as steps of the survey lifecycle, whereas now we know that they occur in the survey lifecycle, but without oftentimes explicit attempt to link them. This is not always the case, because in situations like CNF that Christoph mentioned about, the fact that the panel surveys work together in both collecting the data and harmonizing the data means that they have greater mechanisms to align the findings from ex-ante and ex-post harmonization in a product that becomes more comparable, but whether these are measures, whether these are the operationalizations of given measurements or given flag indicators. And this takes us back to the picture that actually started the presentation and to the end of this discussion, namely that we are coming back to this idea that both ex-ante and ex-post harmonization are intrinsic to the production of comparative survey data sets, that ex-ante harmonization has more weight, if you want, in what it can achieve in terms of producing comparable data, because you have all the tools before you actually collect the data to ensure that comparability is strongest. But since we know that costs and time, costs of money and of time prevent the expansion of data collection, oftentimes, yet we know that there is information out there that can be used together. And the fact is that we can take comparative data sets that were harmonized at ex-ante and move into thinking how to make use of this wealth of information by bringing them together into data sets that harmonize ex-post. And it's not easy, but what is, I think, interesting and basically provided also the challenge for us going into this effort is that challenges actually make what research is fun of, although sometimes it's very tough, that folks can think about how, and there is room for talking to each other in seeing how to integrate not only the methodology, but also how to bring the stakeholders of these two types of methods together in working on comparative research. So with this, we thank you very much for the attention. And maybe one mention is that some of the chapters that are covered in the book were touched in a more condensed version in items of the harmonization newsletter that we produced as part of the SDR project, and that is available online. Thank you.
Thank you both, Irina and Christoph, very much for this presentation and showing us in really wonderful detail the challenges and procedures for some successful survey data harmonization. We're going to open up for questions now, and what I would ask, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so but I'm sure some of you have things that you would love to discuss with Irina, Christoph, and Kazimierz. So please either just turn on your camera and you can raise your hand or go ahead and speak, and just start with your name and affiliation and then ask your question.
Hey, I'll go first. Hi, Melissa Sedade, I'm with the U.S. Census Bureau on the economic side of the house. So not the households, the businesses, right? And we just completed a 4-year project bringing together 7 legacy annual surveys into one collection. So harmonization has been at the top of our minds for the last 4 years. And one of the things that we really spent a lot of time on was, and you touched on it in your presentation, was unit harmonization, making sure that we're collecting from the same types of units that each one of those 7 surveys was coming together. This is a particular issue to economic surveys. I think it's one of the kind of wrinkles for establishment surveys. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the particularities of harmonization across different kinds of surveys. So are there particular pitfalls? I found myself thinking while we were doing this, like, are there particular issues for health surveys versus for victimization surveys versus for opinion surveys or what have you? I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, given the scope of this volume you've put together.
Actually, the most projects which were involved in this volume dealt with individuals. And in a sense, it's much easier to have this unit of observation and to be sure that we are collecting and then analyzing the appropriate data. The only problem was that in some surveys we had duplicates, and we have to eliminate, for example, duplicates. But other issues were not so much involved as in surveys dealt with households or families. There was one survey which dealt with families, but then it had the structure which was very simple to match individuals.
Well, maybe I would add to this that according to, or one way that, or one thing that one could do is, if I understood correctly, some of the information comes from individuals, others from household surveys. This is what you were asking, I mean, about the household, or you were asking about the fact that this is what you were saying, that the unit of observation was different across these projects?
So for us, the collection unit, right, was different across each of the 7 surveys. So some surveys collected at the company level, some surveys collected at the location level, some companies collected at aggregations of locations called industries. So how do we bring all of those things into alignment into a single collection?
Right.
Yeah.
So I would say that what we would think of as a guiding rule that comes from the book is that you could have a flag variable that records for the given projects the unit level at which the observation was collected, and then you could see whether accounting for this information may impact your results.
I have some knowledge about the there's something called the German business panel, I think. And it is a panel study. So they actually know which units to survey and which have taken part and which will be addressed in the next round. However, a problem you probably also came across, you are not sure that the same person or the same function will answer your survey questions. And oftentimes a survey meant to cover aspects of a business will actually be answered by different persons. So some run from personnel and some run from financing or controlling, and someone close to the CEO might be actually involved. And then the next round, it might be actually slightly different people and this also leads to some inconsistencies because then certain reporting rules get lost or are reinvented all the time. And that is a really notorious problem with any survey, I think, that is meant to cover a collective, where certain people, I mean, even for households, if you want to collect data on households, I often have one person in a household giving all this information. It might be a different person next time, and that person might have a slightly different perspective on the way questions are interpreted. So there might be, just because of these differences in the reporting agent, some differences that really don't reflect change, but are just different perspectives.
Oh,
I think, yeah,
that's a
sorry.
great point. Thank you. I was just thinking about, I had gotten so caught up in unit, but you're right. There is sort of almost like a respondent harmonization that has to happen, right? So who is it that's actually providing the data? That's a great point. Please continue.
I like your question more generally. Are there certain types of variables or areas of information that might be particular to certain types of research questions or units? And one that I still have in mind that I mentioned was this problem with time use surveys that really differ in the resolution of time they use in their instruments to collect time use information. Another is, of course, if you think of medical research, I came across several studies that have to make sense of self-reported height and weight versus measured height and weight from, in a practice, and then you have to stand on a scale and then someone measures your weight, etc. And then you, of course, have very different patterns of measurement error for self-report and for measurement. And I think there are more of these types of examples if we would think a little bit closer or more about this. Yeah.
Thank you. That was terrific.
Wonderful discussion. Any other questions, or what other questions do people have? Yes, Kristen, please. Is it okay for you to, you can come off your mute?
Yes, hi. I just wanted to say hi
Hi.
to Christoph, Irina. Congratulations on the book. It's always wonderful to see books come out, right? You must feel a huge sense of relief. I know you've probably poured hours of your time into this, not to mention all the contributors to the book. Anyway, I oftentimes in our discussions in the past, there's a concern. There's always this unsatiable hunger for data out there, right? And if there's data, people are going to use it. And so one of the concerns that comes up a lot in discussions with especially trying to harmonize or combine data is that some data users may be naive, right? And kind of put data together or use data in inappropriate ways. And I was just wondering to what extent, you feel like producing this book and kind of having a book to point people to is trying to help or advocate, to raise awareness, I guess, among data users to understand more about kind of how the sausage is made, if you will, how the data really is produced, what goes into, in some cases, a lot of complexity as far as harmonizing variables and producing these data sets that are in some ways so easy for data users to pull in and use, depending on the surveys and the survey products. So yeah, just your thoughts on that and the extent to which you're kind of optimistic or pessimistic as far as the knowledge that's out there, how well subject matter experts are doing at understanding and using data appropriately. I know that's kind of a lot, but I just look forward to any thoughts you want to share on that topic.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Is there a way to prevent that people misuse the data? No. No matter how many red flags we would put, they can simply be colorblind. I would think that what is Volume try to do and what has come out of the CSDI guidelines also is the emphasis on documentation and the relevance of documentation before data use. And I think that when we see in the description of each project, we see that each of the project is aware of this issue and tries to make it easier for user to access the documentation and read the documentation. It still is a very time-consuming investment if one wants to familiarize themselves with the data, but I think that the tools are such that it becomes easier. And one hopes that if it becomes easier, right, so you have computer searchable PDF documents or other kind of electronic tools to understand the structure of the data and the properties of measures, then the usage will be more informed. But as you know, we teach, sometimes we know it works or it doesn't work.
Yeah, no, those are some very good points though. And, without documentation, there's no hope, right? So actually having the documentation in existence and then, yes, making it accessible and easier to use, hopefully that gives one reason to hope that users will actually use that documentation to inform their work with the data.
I may add that I am optimistic in the sense that actually working on documentation, it leads to certain standardization of documentation, and then it's much easier to use something which is more standardized than it was at the beginning of survey research, where people did this in various different ways.
That's a really good point. I never, so the process of creating the documentation in some ways, can lead to more standardization, right? Because it raises awareness among the data producers, right? About issues that could be addressed.
Yes.
Christoph, did you have thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Kristen. I really like your question here. So first of all, I am reminded, a little bit off topic, but I am reminded about a discussion we had at my institute, I think about 25 years ago, when for the first time ever it was possible to put data on the web. And then in particular, it was the older advisors we had warned us and say, well, then everyone could download those data and do the stupidest things with it. Well, yeah, that's true. But then on the other hand, there would be millions of others that could use the data to do wonderful things with it. So I think, first of all, this is how we do science, right? Some of us do stupid things, some of us wonderful things, and in the end, we discuss these things, and there are like self-healing processes going on. And in the end, I hope that more or less stupid things are identified, and then you find ways to forget about those and improve your methodologies. And as Maciek said, I think this also pertains to the way we document our harmonized data. And nowadays, most serious researchers are hopefully aware of the importance of referring at least superficially to some documents to understand how data were produced and be aware of the pitfalls. And if they don't realize them and make a mistake, I hope, and usually it is how it works in science, someone else picks up the mistakes and tries to see that this is corrected in the long run. As long as we don't think we're unfailable, I think this system works quite well.
That's great. Yeah, peer review, right? The process of, the scientific process. That's great. Well, it's always good to hear reasons to be optimistic these days. So thank you for those thoughts.
Thank
you. Congratulations again on the book.
Thank you, Kristen.
Kristen and Melissa, and for everybody's attention. We're at time. I want to say also, I love ending on an optimistic note. And point out that AAPOR's very own transparency initiative supports all of these excellent points about documentation and standardization. So I know we're right at time, but I think we can just squeeze in, first of all, a huge thank you to Christoph and Irina and Kazimierz. We so appreciate you taking the time to talk about your wonderful book. And so that, and also Melissa, if you want to announce our book winner name and take us on out.
Yep, our the DC-AAPOR member that's won a copy of today's book is Sarah Spell. Sarah, I'll be in touch with you to get some information to get you that book. And while I've got the mic, I just want to point out to you that next week on May 1st, we're going to be hosting a happy hour at Mission Bar in DuPont Circle. Go ahead and join us there. It's going to be a great time. And then on June 20th, we'll have our next book club, this time featuring this year's AAPOR Book Award winner, Peter Enns, talking about his book, Incarceration Nation. That's on June 20th. And don't forget to save the date on September 24th for our Review Preview Conference, our annual conference. But otherwise, thank you so much to our guests today. Thanks, Martha, for hosting us, and have a great rest of your day. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
for having us. Goodbye.
Bye.
Have a great week.